So we're not done. We're only done with my questioning. Now it's time for you to ask some questions. Who would like to begin? We have microphones, so here, and introduce yourself. Why don't you begin? But you need the mic.
My name's Keith Hoffman. I'm a senior, majoring in political science and English. There's a pretty broad consensus among all of the panelists, it seems, that the recession will end by the end of the year, within a couple of years, which as a senior still doesn't really help me. But I'm curious, what event, what kind of crisis or bungle could actually lengthen the recession in your minds, or cause it to become a depression?
Hal?
Okay, so if we look back and try and learn there are some things we can learn from the Great Depression. And actually, it's a fairly negative lesson about the New Deal. So there are a lot of positive things that were done during the New Deal, and the country political institutions stayed intact, and that was a huge accomplishment. On the other hand, they put in place a very anti-competitive, sort of distortionary set of policies that are commonly called the National Recovery Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, and the National Recovery Administration. So I think one thing to have in mind is there's some very negative things that we can do in terms of intervening and interfering with the market working. And my own research has argued that that was an important factor in dragging out the Great Depression after 1933.
Don?
One of the lessons is never to assume you can't make a bad situation worse. And we have it in our power to really make this one worse if we engage in massive protectionism in an effort to try to save American jobs. We could screw up the banking recovery, and we could do that in a very big way. We could put a lot of anti-competitive efforts in, for example, in the way of the recovery and the restructuring of the auto industry, in the effort to try to save jobs in the short term in a way that could make the industry harder to thrive in the long term. We could really make a mess out of this unless we're careful and smart.
You mentioned protectionism. There is a America First aspect of the stimulus package. Jennifer, how is that going to affect the global response?
Well, that has, I mean, the U.S. government has had to deal with that because we have the World Trade Organization that has rules against certain things. We're a member of that. Yeah, that has led to a lot of concern and the need for Timothy Geithner to explain those kinds of things. So I think that we need to avoid protectionism, but also related to lessons learned, things like as much as the public hates to see banks get money, we know historically that dictating the terms of lending to banks doesn't always lead to positive outcomes over time, for example. So that kind of intervention, I think we know also doesn't work very well.
Up there, yes.
Hi, my name is Aaron Werner. I'm a senior history and economics major here at Penn. My question is about the Federal Reserve. We talked earlier, you talked about giving the Fed some grades. Now that the Fed has taken a lifeline from the Treasury, many would call into question its independence. I'm wondering if you all would see that as a problem, or even if it's not a problem right now, if it could be a problem down the line.
I think that we always have to worry about Federal Reserve independence. And down the line, when we're through this crisis, it's going to be very important to get back to normal business where a central bank sets monetary policy and has clear independence from the administration. And I think that'll come in time. But now we're in the middle of a crisis, and it's absolutely essential for the Treasury and the Fed to be working together. And I must say that that's been done from the very beginning of the crisis. Under the Bush administration with Paulson, as well as today with Geithner. Geithner, of course, was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, so there's a natural transition here where we have Geithner in place at the Treasury and understands the problems, and he's been cooperating with Bernanke and the Fed from the very beginning.
Terrific. Over here?
My name is Yala Peter Side, and usually I'm assistant professor of pediatrics, so I'm a little off place here. My question is this, that does the panel think that this problem is being coordinated globally, the address to this problem is being coordinated globally, such that the remedies that we put forth don't have negative rebound effects across the world, especially in third world countries with dropping commodity prices, dropping oil prices, which is good for us because we can pay less money. But in the long term, will America be able to recover if everybody else doesn't recover?
So what is this doing to third world and other countries who, if they don't benefit from it, will continue to see a worldwide problem? At first, by the way, experts thought this was going to be a localized downturn, but it's spread absolutely globally.
Precisely because securities markets aren't so well developed in developing countries and third world countries. But after the Lehman Brothers collapse, everything changed. I think that the best thing the United States can do for the world is to get our economy back on track. And that's what was said when Japan was in its crisis as well, because it's such a large market of consumer demand. So if we just think about China, okay, there's a lot of talk about how China absorbs so many exports. But the final market for most of the demand is, China is a staging area for a lot of goods that are then value added on in China and then exported on to the United States. So the downturn in the US market has just huge consequences, not only for China, but also for Japan, which is also an export-oriented market. We have lots of economies that are still very dependent on exports to drive their growth, and that are now going to have to look more at internal demand. But in the meantime, for them, one of the best things is for the US to get the economy growing again, for demand to be there.
Would you say that's true for all third world economies?
In general, yes, yes.
Where?
We have a question from one of our internet viewers. This is from the Facebook interface from the forum that was hosted by Knowledge at Wharton. And the question is, as a Penn alum abroad, it strikes me that we lack the global institutions to deal with social fallout of the collapse and to rebuild our economies. Government response seems to be reactive, building programs on the fly, but I'm not sure that impactful programs are really shovel-ready, as American officials might put it. What are 2 or 3 types of institutions you think are important for us to start building now to deal with long-term effects of this and other crises? It's from Robin Bose, a Penn alum in India.
Well, we certainly have the institutions. We have the World Bank for direct development assistance. We have the International Monetary Fund to provide short-term financing. The problem is that the financial markets, the securities markets, have broken down as far as the emerging markets are concerned. They cannot get the financing that they normally rely upon. And the banks aren't going to provide it, and the securities markets are not. And so there's certainly a role for the IMF to step in and provide assistance on a larger scale than they normally do. And there's certainly a role for the World Bank as well. The emerging markets are suffering. On top of that, the emerging markets that depend upon commodity markets are suffering even more. And those are many of the emerging markets. So we have 2 things going on. We have the collapse of the export market, exporting to the United States and to Europe. And then, in addition, we have the collapse of the commodities market. So emerging markets in particular are very much harmed by this crisis. And as a result, I would expect the IMF to be the lender of last resort in some sense, providing the kind of financing we need. But it has to be on a larger scale than normal.
So really scaling up of IMF and World Bank responses.
That's
David?
right.
And just to add one small thing to that, it seems to me this is a real stress test for the IMF and the World Bank. If the IMF and the World Bank in particular, I think, with the emerging markets, doesn't step up to the plate, I think we're going to see a lot of regional authorities stepping in, so that in Latin America they'll try to handle some of these issues locally. There's been a lot of talk over the years of developing an Asian development bank to kind of serve as a substitute for the IMF. And I think if the IMF and the World Bank don't step up, there's going to be a huge loss of confidence in them, and people are going to turn to these other alternatives.
So we have 2, IMF and World Bank.
Just to sort of add on to this, the IMF, actually, Japan already pledged $17 billion to the IMF for a special fund to help countries that are hit by this crisis. Because one aspect or characteristic of this crisis is it's not due to failed policies that these countries are getting hit. this isn't a result of failed fiscal policy or the kinds of crises we saw in Latin America in the 80s or things like that. So the conditions for lending or for support through the IMF have to be different in this case. And so we're seeing those kinds of discussions go on. And some countries, such as Japan, that are net creditor nations, still are able to give money even though their economies aren't doing so well.
Could I add a little
Yeah,
bit
Hal.
on this?
Do we have other?
First of all, the history of sovereign borrowing by developing countries is not a positive history. And there's a lot of questions about it. If you look about, they talk about like the lost decade in Mexico. When these countries go into default and they ratchet up their debt and run into these problems, the consequences are extremely negative. So when we talk sort of very loosely about extending credits to these countries and loans to them, let's keep in mind what the negative history was. So that's one statement. And I think, just to put a slightly different perspective on it, and I want to follow up on a comment that Dick made at the end, which is a lot of what we need to do is to roll back our regulatory structure to what it was, 1980. That's a negative statement about how negative this crisis is. I mean, there's got some other things that go with it, but there's not a positive message on that.
I just want to take issue with one statement about emerging market countries, because there has been no emerging market country that's just been clobbered by this crisis. It was due to a bad decision that was taken in line with the chronology of this crisis. I mean, this is something that hit every country around the globe, regardless of their history in terms of their sovereign debt funding. And we need to recognize that and realize that this crisis is centered in the United States. And there are a lot of countries out there, a lot of people here are thinking about jobs and their pensions, but there are a lot of other people out there in countries that have just been dropped below the poverty line. And the degree and the depth of resentment and frustration that this crisis is going to generate, or has already generated around the globe, I think is underappreciated in the United States. We are much more likely to come out of this recession and for our real economy to turn around much more quickly than Japan is, or China. Well, China is not going to stop growth, but the slowdown in growth has huge actual concrete implications for how society works. But many other countries are going to be feeling the results of this crisis for years on. And just to give you an example.
We haven't, but countries in Africa, a lot of the...
Just an example would be Korea.
Emerging economies are really going to be hit hard.
No, but export-led growth, she's right. Yeah. The export-led growth countries, they are getting killed.
Korea. Yeah. So you ask, well, why was Korea under so much distress this past year? I mean, partly because its markets were more liquid. And the U.S. Federal Reserve put in place a swap agreement with the Korean Central Bank in order to help them out in this point in time. And this was a case where, actually, rather than regional institutions coming into play, the United States still has a really critical role to play in the world, and it was appropriate, I think, given the source of the problems.
Yeah.
But one thing that may happen out of all this is that American autonomy in the world may not be quite what it was before. That one of the problems is we may not be able to roll back to 1980 because there may be a lot of other countries that are going to have real concerns about how we allowed us to be able to get them into all the trouble. There's going to be a lot more international pushback in this as well. So that the real answer to the question that came in, we have a lot of the institutions. What we don't have is consensus. And there are a lot of other countries who are less willing now to give us our lead to be able to set the course that others will follow.
One question up there.
Well, a change, a bit of a change.
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, my name is Patrick Starr, and I graduated in '79 from Penn. And my question goes back to the core of what I think you've already said caused this, which is the housing crisis. And is this crisis that we're facing now a game changer in terms of America's economic development policies, which have been based on a consumer society since the 30s, and housing has been a critical component of that consumer society? Is this really going to change our economic policy? Is that what's been called into question here?
So are we going to continue to be, or should we continue to be, if people do the right thing, the same consumer society we were before we got into this mess?
Well, I would give different answers to those two questions. Should we be the same? I think the answer is no. Will we be the same? I fear that the answer is going to be yes. And a good for instance on that is our policy on housing, which Dr. Gutmann referred to earlier. I think we really need to rethink all the subsidies that we give to people who are buying houses and all the pressure we put on lenders to lend into the housing market, and ask the question whether everybody can genuinely afford to have a house. And that's just one piece of consumer borrowing. You could say similar things, I think, about credit cards and other pieces of consumer borrowing. But it's not yet clear to me that there is going to be change after this passes. I think the verdict is still out on that.
I said I wanted this to...
I think that there's huge, unanimity behind what you just said.
Right.
I mean, I think we'd all agree and raise our hand. Let me just make one quick comment, which is...
I didn't know we all agreed on anything.
No, I thought that one, I thought the team was shoulder to
Hal,
shoulder.
one quick comment, and then I'm going to
Okay.
wrap up.
Households have taken a huge hit in terms of the value of their homes and the value of their financial portfolios. That's likely to lead to some shifts in terms of their behavior, in terms of consumption versus savings and the composition of their savings. So, I would think that'd be a response.
Good. This is a good place to end because it's about rethinking, and that's what universities are all about. And so I hope this has been an aperitif to stimulate more thought about where we can go from this really historic crisis. And now I just want to thank once again our panel of experts for a most stimulating afternoon. Thank you all. That was